Hi, everybody. I'm
Hey,
I'm Amelia,
I'm Tom.
and
Hi,
this is
friends.
hi, everybody. This is Monday with Jesus, um, because we send these YouTube videos out in e-letter, and we usually get them sent out on Monday. Once in a while, we don't quite make it, but that's the goal. And so, but I wanted to announce before we get started on today's story for next Sunday that we're going to be taking a summer break. So this will be our last Monday with Jesus until September. Hope you have a great month of
Break
August.
for August.
Yeah, just for August. So we'll get caught up with those lectionary stories at some point, probably after we finish off Matthew next year. But because we'll continue to stay with whatever the gospel is for lectionary year C. So anything else you want to add to that, Tom?
Nope.
Okay, all right. So today's story is from Gospel of Luke. We're in the 12th chapter, and Tom will tell it for us.
This is the story. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." And Jesus said, "Friend, who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And then he said to them, "Watch out, take care, be on your guard against all forms of greed, because life does not consist in the abundance of one's possessions." And he told them a parable. The land of a certain rich man brought forth abundantly, and he said to himself, what am I going to do? Because I have nowhere to store my grain and my crops. And then he said, I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my old barns and I'll build up new, bigger ones. And there I'll store all my grain and my crops. And then I will say to my soul, soul, you have enough goods stored up for many years. Eat, drink, relax, be merry. But that night, God said to him, fool, this night your life is required of you. And as for all these possessions that you've collected, whose are they going to be? That's how it is with those who are rich in stuff and poor toward God.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah, that kind
That's the attention.
of. It's one of those cases where I want to say, now you're meddling, Jesus. Meddling with our consumerist society for sure.
Yeah, well, he had no idea what a capitalist society would be.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're going to talk about that in a minute. First, I want to talk about the setting. This man comes, and I guess there's a crowd, right? So
Yeah, there's someone in the crowd. He was teaching the crowd that gathered around him.
so it's not just his disciples. Is it is a big crowd? I mean, sometimes he had really big crowds.
No, this doesn't look like a big one.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, it's a crowd. He calls out and he says, and he asked Jesus to do something for him. Well, last week we had this whole series of teachings about prayer, and recommendations that Jesus said. And so one of the things was, whatever you ask for, or, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. So here this guy is, asking for something. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance. But Jesus says no, right? Yeah, I mean, he's straight refusal. He's not going to do that. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yep.
Did Jesus, and then he tells this parable. Did Jesus compose all these parables? I mean, is he just that great of a storyteller? He could pull these out and um, maybe
Well, it looks that way. I mean, that probably the setting, this thing of the man in the crowd saying, "Teacher, make my brother divide the inheritance." That's probably the creation of a later storyteller, Luke, providing a framework for the story and finding ways to weave the various stories of Jesus that he had learned and heard. And so the probability is that that Luke, the Lucan, storyteller, comprised and composed this setting of this guy asking for help with his brother, and that Jesus had composed the story of the rich fool, and it had been passed on for decades, and Luke included it then in this way, provided this setting for it.
Wasn't there a parable like back that Nathan told, or
Yeah.
so it was that? Were there other parables in between that one and this one?
Well, there
That was
are a
quite.
lot.
That was
There are what in Hebrew are called mashal. There are proverbs, sayings, but the way in which Jesus developed the parable, Nathan's parable is the only one that I know of that is really like Jesus. And that was the story that he told David of the poor man who had a lamb and the rich man who had a whole bunch of sheep. And a guy came and for a visit, and he took the poor man's lamb and sacrificed that and fed it to him. And David was infuriated and said that man should die. And Nathan said, "You're the man." And David was cut to the heart. Well, this is a similar dynamic. Everybody can identify with this rich man, and his problem of not having enough room to store all his crops, and his solution. So this word,
everybody can identify with a rich man.
sure.
Maybe, I don't know.
Well, identify in the sense of being envious and thinking, boy, that'd be great.
Okay.
To have that problem. So for the majority of people who aren't rich, and that was the case, especially in the ancient world, in Jesus' day, there were some rich people who owned the land, and then these
yeah, how rich would they be?
Well,
and what would they be like? Do we know?
Well, they were the people who lived in Rome and in the great cities, had big houses, and so we don't know, and we wouldn't estimate in terms of dollars or anything how wealthy they were, but they had great possessions, and they leased out their land to people, to peasants. So it was a peasant economy, where the great majority of people were peasants who lived off the land, had a basically subsistence way of life. And then there were a few, a very small percentage, who were rich, who owned the land and had problems like this.
So Jesus responds to the man's request or demand, or however what would be that you would tell this, really not by just a direct no, but by saying, "Who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" And then he says, take care, be on guard against all kinds of greed. So he has a statement there, and then he launches into this parable. How is
Right.
the parable an answer to the man's request for a division of the inheritance?
Well, clearly the motive, the issue,
Mhm.
and this happened, this is reflected in the parable of the prodigal son. When there was an inheritance, over 50% of the inheritance went to the oldest son, and then the rest was distributed among the younger ones. And so the younger sons would, protest the domination of the elder son, and so and would, want more money from the inheritance. And so Jesus' response is, watch out for being greedy. And that would apply to the eldest son as well as the younger son.
And what was he? I mean, he's addressing the request of the man, but you get the feeling he's also talking to, to the crowd, teaching something a little bit bigger than just an answer to this man's question.
Right.
What's the larger point Jesus is? I mean, I know we don't like to talk about points, but what do you think he's trying to communicate through this parable, or do through this parable, in terms of the larger crowd, on the
Right.
assumption that he would be doing that, which like a teachable moment? I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, the teachable moment is to shock people into being envious of the rich man, to shock them out of that, and to think about what's involved in accumulating a whole bunch of goods, when the likelihood, possibility is always there that your life will be required from you for that the next day, that night. So to think about this desiring to have the problem that the rich man had from the perspective of then being a fool whose life is required by God, makes you think. And that's, his goal was to free people from preoccupation with accumulating a whole lot of goods.
Yeah, it really makes you think about what is important in life. I mean, what are the priorities? What has lasting value, I guess. All these things, all these accumulated things that we all want, it doesn't have lasting value.
We're not rich toward God.
Yeah, right. Right.
To build up.
And that being rich towards God does have lasting value.
Right.
Yeah. What is Jesus's attitude towards wealth in general? Do we have some clues about that?
Well, in general, he's pretty skeptical about the value of wealth and is pretty polemical against rich people. So he's quite, I'd say, tough about this, and is critical of the rich, and is an advocate of the poor. So the basic attitude toward wealth and riches is very critical of Jesus, and so he's always thinking back from the coming of the kingdom of God in the future into the present. And so this parable is a classic example of that, is to think back from the future as to what's going to be of value, and that riches don't really count for that much.
Yesterday morning, I went to what was called Church in the Wild. So this was a group of maybe a dozen people. We were at Possum Creek Park here in metropolitan Dayton. Beautiful location, with overlooking the lake, and there were geese around the lake. It was really lovely. Until we had an incredible thunderstorm. Actually, that was kind of lovely too. But anyway, while we were all in the circle, we were sharing, we were supposed to bring a poem or a reading of some sort, mostly to do with nature. But one fellow had a just like one sentence that he had offered to the circle. And it was this, that Americans are more likely to be able to imagine the end of the world than they can imagine the end of capitalism. And that really caught my attention. I thought that was interesting. Actually kind of made sense to me. I think was a quote that he heard someplace. But this story, I just wondered, what are the implications of this parable in terms of ministries of justice in a capitalist economy, which is what we certainly have in the United States. And to talk about it otherwise gets you into a lot of trouble, if you're a politician anyway.
Right. Well, the overall, there was kind of a capitalist economy in the ancient world, but it wasn't what we would call capitalism and the accumulation of vast amounts of money. The emperors and so on were vastly wealthy. And so there were things of what we would call accumulation of capital. But Jesus was very critical of that economic system and was an advocate for the redistribution of income to the poor. So the clear message in Jesus' teaching is against a capitalist accumulation of money by a few, and then by resulting in the impoverishment of the minority or of the majority of people. So it's pretty clear that in terms of ministries of justice, that economic justice would call for a more much more egalitarian distribution of money. What's happening in the United States is a growing gap between the very rich and the 80 to 90% of the common people. And Jesus would be opposed to that. And his teachings teach against that kind of accumulation of capital.
Yeah, and Dr. King is in his, I think it was his last book, called for a universal minimum income that everyone would have. So I think, it's more keeping at least with what the early church understood an economy would be, because they shared everything in common. And but that's another story for another day, perhaps, when we get into the book of Acts. So is there anything else you want to share about this particular story, this parable, the rich fool?
Well, this is a classic Jesus parable of addressing an issue that is present for everyone then and now. That is of being jealous of and wanting more stuff, more goods, more distribution of income. And Jesus' teaching is to beware of that spirit of greed and the degree to which it contributes to all kinds of injustice. And so that spirit of greed, of wanting to gather more, and in the words of I remember Wall Street, is saying, greed is good. Everybody loves greed. And so Jesus wouldn't agree with that.
You mean the movie? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Jesus, it's interesting because in the parable, Jesus is not saying you shouldn't have, what you need to survive. But in the parable, the man, his big dilemma is, how am I going to store all this stuff? Well, one way to solve that problem would be to give the excess away. So,
right.
Yeah, but that wasn't his way of solving it. All right. Well, thanks for being with us, everybody. Have a wonderful month of August, and take care about greed, because we all succumb to that wanting more way of being. Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Grace and peace.